Okay, guys, Waikit here again. This segment we talk about cost of customer acquisition, COCA. So you guys assume have some rough idea of sort of why that is important, obviously, and how to sort of calculate it at a high level. So I think in this segment, what I actually like to do is actually dive a bit more into the next level, the next step of what is interesting in terms of what you ought to calculate and the insights it ought to yield. Right. So we peel the COCA onion one layer. One thing I think about is segmentation. When you have a product or service that you're selling, chances are you're selling to more than one segment, right? Depending on how you define your segments. And one of the biggest insight the COCA analysis can tell you is what segments perform better, where you should be spending your money, where you should be focusing on, right? And some of these segments could be vertical segments, it certainly could be horizontal segments or some other delineation, right? So anyway, so for some formalism, this is how you ought to think about COCA at one level. Marketing COCA equals to total marketing spend multiplied by total percentage of total leads in that segment. Right? So this is all, by the way, segment based, right? Again, you want to do this for every segment. You want to do this analysis, right? Sales COCA equals to total sales spend multiplied by percentage of sales reps selling into that segment, right? Again, you want to do this for every segment, and then the total COCA for that segment is just summing up the two subcomponents, right? So then you get essentially a cost of customer acquisition for that segment, right? And then you compare it with other segments. So the thing to think about here is marketing spend, the definition of spend, right? So marketing spend, so obviously include commission, direct spend, program spend, but it ought to include salaries and all kinds of overhead to really capture the full extent of the spend, right? So you're amortizing the cost into the acquisition itself to really get a true measure of things. Same thing of sales, right? Similar definition. Now, here is where it gets interesting once you start getting and filling this data. Oh, by the way, before I even get into that, it's important to say that we're glossing over a bunch of details too. So this is version 1. You can be nth degree sophisticated in cutting this down. So for example, this assumes that all the salespeople are paid equally between segments. It may not, and certainly, I'm assuming inside and field sales here. So there's a bunch of things that I think at the first level, first order analysis that you can gloss over. That's totally fine. So here's the goal. Once you have all this data, the goal is to get lowest cost segments, right? So once you have your COCAs per segment, figure out which is the lowest cost segments. Now that is not enough because ideally you also want to be able to figure out your biggest ROI, your highest ROI on your spend. Which segment gives you the biggest ROI on that spend? So this is actually interesting because you will find sometimes that certain segments, this may be micro segments, as you spend more money, let's call this ROI, the ROI plateaus out due to some sort of saturation factor, right? So you want to also figure out how scalable that segment is based on the spend, depending on what kind of channels that you're using, right? So An example of this, for example, is you are, this is a very bad example, but it's simplistic. You are advertising your product in a newsletter that goes to 5,000 people, right? So as you spend more money to buy ad placement in that newsletter, your ROI goes up because it's the newsletter is going to people who is endemic to the product or the service that you're selling. But the problem is that the newsletter is of a certain size. So once you saturate your spend, you bought all the available ad slots. This plateaus out, right? So some rule of thumb generally. Again, I sometimes hesitate to use rule of thumb, but just to kind of put some numbers. A good benchmark for COCA, roughly speaking, the rule of thumb is payback period of less than 12 months. That's good. Obviously, it has so many assumptions, right? An assumption is, if you are a high growth startup, making tens of millions of dollars in revenue, this might be a high bar, right? So if you're growing a lot, you're actually spending a lot to acquire new customers, so your payback period actually might be longer than 12 months. But that's where kind of some of the trade-off with your growth rate, your COCA, and which we didn't touch upon yet, which is the other side of COCA. The other side of the coin is the lifetime value of the customer, which we will tackle hopefully in a different session.